Is the United Nations losing its relevance? Founded after World War II, the UN aimed to prevent future global conflicts and promote cooperation. But today, cracks are appearing in this once unshakable institution. Some nations are questioning the UN's effectiveness and fairness. Could this dissatisfaction lead to a seismic shift in global power dynamics? The world watches with bated breath as BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, voice their growing discontent with the UN. Fault lines emerge. BRICS nations challenge the global order. At the heart of this brewing crisis lies a fundamental disagreement: the distribution of power. BRICS nations, with their growing economic clout and geopolitical influence, demand a larger say in global affairs. They believe the current UN system, largely shaped after World War II, fails to reflect their newfound standing. The Security Council, the UN's most powerful body, is a particular point of contention. BRICS nations argue that its composition, with 5 permanent members holding veto power, is outdated and undemocratic. This structure, they argue, grants disproportionate influence to Western nations, stifling the voices of emerging economies. This power imbalance, BRICS nations argue, extends beyond the Security Council, permeating various UN agencies and decision-making processes. Section 1. Western Bias, a bone of contention. A key grievance fueling BRICS nations' discontent is the perception of ingrained Western bias within the UN system. They argue that this bias manifests in various forms, from the selection of leadership positions to the setting of global agendas. This perceived imbalance, they contend, undermines the UN's credibility and effectiveness in addressing global challenges. One of the most contentious issues is the overrepresentation of Western nations in key UN leadership roles. Historically, the positions of Secretary General and the heads of major UN agencies have been predominantly held by individuals from Western countries. This pattern, BRICS nations argue, perpetuates a Western-centric worldview and limits the diversity of perspectives within the UN system. Section 2. Double standards on display. From human rights to humanitarian aid. The perception of double standards in the UN's approach to human rights and humanitarian crises further fuels BRICS nations' discontent. They point to instances where they believe the UN has applied different standards to Western nations and developing countries, particularly those within the BRICS bloc. BRICS nations, particularly China and Russia, often face criticism for their human rights records. While these concerns are not unfounded, BRICS nations argue that similar issues in Western nations often receive less scrutiny or are met with muted responses from the international community. This perceived inconsistency, they contend, exposes a hypocritical approach to human rights. Section 3. Representation and influence, a call for reform. Beyond accusations of bias and double standards, a fundamental issue driving BRICS nations' discontent is the lack of adequate representation and influence within key global governance frameworks. They argue that the current system, designed in a bygone era, fails to reflect their growing economic and geopolitical clout in the 21st century. BRICS nations collectively represent a significant portion of the world's population, landmass, and economic output. Yet, they argue, their influence within institutions like the UN, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund remains disproportionately low compared to their global standing. This disparity, they contend, undermines their ability to contribute meaningfully to shaping global rules and addressing common challenges. A prime example of this disparity is the structure of the UN Security Council. The 5 permanent members, all victors of World War II, hold veto power, effectively granting them the ability to block any resolution, regardless of the level of international support. Section 1. Economic and Developmental Concerns. A Clash of Visions. The discord between BRICS nations and the established Western powers extends beyond issues of representation and influence. At the heart of the matter lies a fundamental difference in economic and developmental philosophies. BRICS. Nations argue that the current global economic order, largely shaped by Western institutions and principles, often fails to address their unique needs and priorities. BRICS nations, many of which have experienced rapid economic growth in recent decades, emphasize the importance of state-led development models. They argue that Western-promoted policies, often centered around free markets and liberalization, can be counterproductive for developing economies, leading to instability and social unrest. Section 2. The Weight of Conditionalities. A Source of Resentment. A particular point of contention centers around the issue of conditionalities attached to financial aid and development assistance. BRICS nations argue that Western-led institutions often impose stringent and often inappropriate conditions that undermine their sovereignty and hinder their development goals. They contend that these conditions, often based on Western economic orthodoxies, can be counterproductive and even harmful to developing economies. For instance, austerity measures, often imposed as a condition for receiving financial assistance, can exacerbate poverty and social inequality, leading to political instability. Adding another layer of complexity to the BRICS nations' discontent is the backdrop of intensifying geopolitical rivalries. The rise of China as a global power, in particular, has shifted the balance of power and created new tensions in the international system. Western nations, accustomed to their dominant position, are grappling with China's growing economic and military might. They view China's assertive foreign policy, particularly in its neighborhood, as a challenge to the established order. This rivalry has spilled over into various domains, including trade, technology, and security. BRICS nations increasingly view Western-led development assistance with skepticism, questioning its effectiveness and underlying motives. They argue that the current aid architecture, dominated by Western donors and institutions, often perpetuates dependency rather than fostering sustainable development. One of their primary criticisms is the often conditional nature of Western aid. BRICS nations contend that these conditions, often tied to economic reforms or political changes favored by Western donors, can undermine their sovereignty and hinder their ability to pursue development paths tailored to their unique circumstances. The global trade regime, with its complex web of rules and agreements, is another arena where BRICS nations perceive an uneven playing field. They argue that the current system, largely shaped by Western interests, disadvantages developing countries and perpetuates historical inequalities. A key point of contention is the issue of agricultural subsidies. BRICS nations argue that the substantial subsidies provided by Western governments to their farmers distort global markets, making it difficult for farmers in developing countries to compete fairly. Shifting sands. The rise of BRICS and global power dynamics. The growing discontent within BRICS nations is inextricably linked to the shifting sands of global power. The rise of these emerging economies, particularly China and India, has challenged the traditional Western-dominated world order, creating both opportunities and frictions on the global stage. The BRICS nations collectively possess significant economic weight, accounting for a substantial portion of global GDP and trade. This economic ascent has translated into greater geopolitical clout, enabling them to assert their interests more forcefully and demand a greater voice in international affairs. A fractured world, navigating geopolitical fault lines. The escalating rivalry between the United States and China, the world's two largest economies, casts a long shadow over the future of global governance. This rivalry, fueled by a clash of values, economic interests, and strategic ambitions, has deepened divisions within the UN and other multilateral institutions. BRICS nations often find themselves caught in the crossfire of this great power competition. While they share some common ground with both the US and China on certain issues, they are also wary of being drawn into a zero-sum game that could undermine their own interests. The genesis of global governance, birth of the United Nations. To understand the current discontent with the United Nations, one must delve into its historical roots. The UN's formation in 1945 marked a pivotal moment in human history, a collective effort to prevent the horrors of World War II from ever recurring. Born from the ashes of a devastating conflict, the UN embodied the hopes and aspirations of a war-torn world yearning for peace and stability. 51 nations, united in their determination to forge a new path for humanity, came together to sign the UN Charter, a document enshrining the principles of international cooperation, dialogue, and the peaceful resolution of disputes. The early years of the UN were marked by the escalating tensions of the Cold War. The ideological divide between the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist bloc, spearheaded by the Soviet Union, cast a long shadow over the organization's work. The Security Council, often paralyzed by vetoes from the opposing superpowers, struggled to address major international crises. The UN's role, instead, often shifted towards peacekeeping and mediation, deploying missions to contain regional conflicts and prevent the escalation of Cold War tensions into direct confrontation between the superpowers. As dissatisfaction with the United Nations mounts, particularly among BRICS nations, calls for alternative models of global governance are gaining traction. These proposals, driven by a desire for a more equitable and representative world order, seek to address the perceived shortcomings of the current system. One prominent alternative vision centers on strengthening regional organizations, such as the African Union, ASEAN, and the European Union. Proponents argue that these regional bodies are often better positioned to address local challenges and foster cooperation among neighboring countries. Beyond institutional reforms, calls for a more just and equitable world order extend to rethinking the very principles that underpin global cooperation. BRICS nations, in particular, are advocating for a departure from what they see as a Western-centric worldview that has dominated international relations for too long. Central to this vision is the concept of multipolarity, a world where power is distributed more evenly among multiple centers of influence, rather than concentrated in the hands of a few powerful nations. This multipolar order, proponents argue, would be more democratic, stable, and responsive to the needs of a diverse global community. The potential for a BRICS departure from the UN presents a stark and unsettling question. Can the current global order, built on the foundations of a bygone era, adapt to the realities of a rapidly changing world? The dissatisfaction expressed by BRICS nations, rooted in concerns over fairness, representation, and accountability, reveals deep fissures within the international system. The world stands at a crossroads. The path ahead is fraught with uncertainty, but one thing is clear: the status quo is unsustainable. Ignoring the legitimate grievances of BRICS nations or dismissing their concerns as mere rhetoric risks further fracturing the global community and undermining the very institutions designed to promote peace and cooperation. Addressing these challenges demands a fundamental rethink of global governance. It requires a willingness to move beyond entrenched power structures, embrace a more inclusive and equitable approach, and empower emerging voices in shaping the rules of the game. The alternative, a world fragmented by rivalry, mistrust, and competing visions of order is a bleak prospect, one that threatens to unravel decades of progress and plunge the world into an era of uncertainty and conflict. The choice is ours. Will we cling to an outdated system, or will we seize this moment to forge a new path, one that reflects the aspirations of all nations and Praedervistauners? Temenasher Raider Boer. And raid the way for a more just, sustainable, and peaceful future. The stakes are too high to ignore. The time for action is now.